of themselves and just explain where you saw possibly how the conservation and housing crisis emerged and some of the barriers that your area of expertise. So Jamie, if you want to go first. Yes.
Sure. So thanks for inviting me to be part of this tonight. Looking forward to the conversation. I work for Vermont Natural Resources Council. We're an organization that's been working in Vermont for 60 years. We do a lot of work in state policy in the legislature, and going back into the 1960s, there was really a growing awareness that we had some conservation needs in the state. There were certainly some land use needs identified as the interstate came into Vermont. It was much easier for people to travel from our metropolitan areas. There was a lot of second home development and ski area development happening in Vermont, and there was really no land use approach to address impacts such as raw sewage literally rolling down into our water bodies from the development that was happening. And so I would say, it was back in during that time when the state got more serious about sort of coming up with Act 250 to look at statewide review for environmental impacts. We had a whole growth in our conservation movement, including conservation activities, conservation programs that were addressed to try and maintain our rural natural resources and our working lands, and to plan for growth in a way that kind of supported our villages and a compact settlement vision for Vermont, much like we see, today still intact in Vermont. So, yeah, I would say that, that was really the growth of the conservation, time in Vermont and movement. And there's so much we can explore about the work that's been done through that, but that's the beginning point that I have in mind. And I'm sorry, was the second question barriers or?
No, that's perfect. We kind of just
Okay.
wanted to frame the issue and just get a better idea of kind of where people have seen it emerge. And you just popcorn in any of the other panels. So just Jonathan.
I'm happy to jump in next. My name's Jess Newbelt. I'm a senior developer at Evernorth. We are a statewide and really northern New England-wide affordable housing nonprofit developer, funder, investor, lender. Um, we are the merged product of what used to be Housing Vermont with a similar organization based in Maine. So I work on development, affordable housing development, multifamily development across the state with local partners in each case, including Jonathan Farrell from COTS on one of my very first deals here. Um, so I guess in terms of the housing crisis, similar to conservation, has been a slow moving crisis that has kind of really snowballed in the last couple of years to become something much more visible and much more critical, um, around the same time as the pandemic, but it's been coming our way for a long time. We, in the 70s and 80s, were developing, up to 5,000 housing units a year. And then from the recession, 2008, 2009 on, we started developing about 1,000 new units a year. And, that barely, if at all, compensates for units that are lost to floods, fires, age, and certainly doesn't compensate for the growth that we've seen in recent years. So I think the housing crisis has been a long time coming and has really become much more visible in recent years, but is not exactly a new phenomenon. I think that's where I'd leave it. Jonathan, I'm calling on you.
Okay, I'll jump in next. Thanks, Jess. Hi, folks. Jonathan Farrell, the Executive Director at the Committee on Temporary Shelter. We are based in Burlington. We also go by COTS, so you can call us COTS. We are a homeless services agency. We were founded in 1982 in response to the first sort of visible homelessness that happened in the city of Burlington. All local folks, many Vietnam veterans who were sleeping rough in the city. As Jess said, it's the crisis has been with us for quite some time. I've been with COTS 14 years now, And we've been struggling with a vacancy rate in the Burlington and the Chittenden County area of less than 1% of available housing. Um, a healthy city should have 5% of its units vacant at any given time. So it's not a new phenomenon, but it has been compounded both by the pandemic and it's been compounded just by rising prices. So folks are bottlenecked. People who want to buy houses are having trouble doing so. The prices are so high that leaves renters who want to move on into their own home stuck there as sort of cascades down to the folks that we see who are sleeping rough and can no longer stay housed. In addition to running homeless shelters, we also run outreach programs, but we also do own affordable housing stock, and we do some development of housing. We've done 3 projects in cooperation with Evernorth, and we own 106 units of housing that is targeted to folks who have experienced homelessness.
All right, so I'll wrap up here. Hi, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity to join tonight's discussion. My name is Abby White, and I'm with the Vermont Land Trust. The Vermont Land Trust has been around since 1977, and since that time, we have conserved over 640,000 acres of land in Vermont. That's roughly 11% of the state. We like to say we help people protect land, care for land, and also connect to land and to one another. Our focus has always been on working lands, so farms and forests. That the farmland and forest land is protected and continues to thrive is to ensure that people who own that land can make a living off of that land. And so we're very much kind of at the intersection of kind of rural economies, ecological protection, and community vitality. Um, One other hat that I wear is that I'm a co-chair of a coalition called the Vermont Housing and Conservation Coalition. And this is comprised of land trusts and conservation organizations and housing organizations across the state that come together to advocate for investments in both housing and conservation through the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board. This coalition started in the mid 80s. It actually preceded the creation of VHCB as an entity. And so it was really these leaders at the time, these advocates that said, look, there's more that we have in common than we have in difference, and that we'll be stronger together. There is a strong recognition that housing and conservation need not be at odds with one another, but when we invest in housing and conservation together in the appropriate areas at the same time, communities thrive. And so that's always this lens that I think I bring to the conversation is that conservation and housing are complementary approaches. We're not in competition for land. And we need to be really thoughtful about where we're conserving and why, and where we're building and why. And in the conversations that I'm having a part of, that there's a lot of common ground there. So it's a question I get often is like, well, aren't you in competition and how do you form this coalition? I said, no, you don't get it. Actually, we've been friends for a really, really long time.
All right. Awesome. Thank you, Abby, and thank you everyone else for introducing yourselves and for all of your backgrounds. I'm really excited to see how each of your unique backgrounds informs your perspective as we get chatting. I think Carolina had to hop off, but we're going to move now into our first section, our more policy-related section. Our first question here is, when we look at Vermont's housing crisis through the lens of policy, what elements of development statutes, such as Act 250, do you see as the most significant barriers to expanding housing? Or conversely, which aspects of these statutes pose the greatest challenges to conservation efforts? Give you each a second to think it over, and then when you're ready, maybe Jamie, we could start with you again.
There's been quite an evolving conversation on this topic over the years. This is not a new topic. I think that many of us have been engaged, especially in conversations in the legislature and with a lot of stakeholders here, organizations here, and interest across the state about how to strike the right balance, recognizing that we do have a housing crisis, and that's, really important to address. Certainly that's part of our values at VNRC, that we need to be really serious about the housing crisis, and that we have a number of environmental, issues that are real challenges for the state, from climate change and the impacts it's having right here in Vermont, and flood resiliency, to an increasing biodiversity crisis and just loss of species due to loss of habitat and other impacts. So understanding sort of what, how to balance that, right? And is there one particular, mechanism that we need to change in Act 250 to address housing and make it easier versus being more successful to address the challenges and conservation? I think I would say it's really hard to identify like one thing that needs to be fixed. I would say that and endorse the process that's unfolded over the last couple of years, especially going back a number of years, where the legislature basically said, let's look under the hood holistically at Act 250 and figure out what comprehensive reform we need to address all of it together. Because every year there was one proposal or another to tweak something in the act versus let's look at it holistically. And really, I think what's important for folks to know, if you haven't been tracking this, is that there was major reform passed last year. It's called Act 181. And it really fundamentally shifts a lot of the approaches in Act 250. It was as much an environmental or conservation bill, because Act 250 is an environmental review bill, as a housing bill. And I really see it as they were complementary. That was the effort was meant to be complementary, and it holistically provides a number of provisions to accelerate housing, to streamline environmental permitting in areas where we want to have more dense growth, areas that will be mapped for more intensive growth that has the backstop of local environmental review. And it balances that with filling in some gaps that have been really present in our state's land use review law. And especially, I work on a lot of forest land conservation issues. There hasn't been a functioning criteria in Act 250 to review impacts to forests. And people, at the end of the day, agreed that that was a gap that should be addressed. So there are some conservation pieces to Act 181 that now would try and encourage good site design, incentivize good site design, development, subdivision in forest, to try and minimize the impacts of fragmentation, to try and identify our state's most critical natural resources and figure out what would be the appropriate environmental review, whether that's through Act 250 or another, policy or program to try and address impacts. So it's that holistic approach that I think is really important.
I guess I would just jump in to echo that last year's reforms went a long way to streamlining the permitting process for housing in places where we want to be building. So, in village centers and downtowns, in what are called neighborhood designated areas. So the state has a system of sort of designating certain places and conveying certain benefits on them. One of those benefits being, particularly now, an ability to bypass Act 250. And I think that it's already helping one of my projects right now, when we're building in places on town water and sewer with bus stops right there. We're building in places with schools and communities and post offices, or sorry, schools and amenities and post offices and businesses. That's where we need housing. That's where, we've already fragmented the forest. We've already sort of interfered with environmental conservation. And so everything we can do to facilitate construction in those locations is really helpful, and not going through kind of onerous, and frankly, Act 250 is quite expensive for multifamily housing. So expensive processes too. So yeah, I applaud last year's efforts, and the interim process that I know more about the interim state than the end goal of where Act 250 will be in a couple of years, but so far so good with the interim.
I'll jump in to say that I think that the Act 250 reform had some real positives coming out of it, including what I believe was a very inclusive process, getting a lot of voices into the mix there. I think broadly there are other constraints on housing in the nation and certainly in Vermont, and a lot of these are zoning, like local zoning regulations that are difficult. Uh, for a period of time, zoning regs were a good business and towns could buy zoning regulations. And they're very cookie cutter off the shelf, right? And prevented a lot of the kinds of natural growth that we once saw, like denser walkable downtowns. There was a real shift in zoning for creating suburban style lots and houses, and everybody needs a car and so on and so forth, taking away some of the townhouse development. So in Burlington, there's been some a good run at reforming some of our zoning to do more neighborhood development, to increase density on lots in the existing town. And as Jess mentioned, I think the development in our downtowns is critical. That's where we want to do. That's where we want housing to be. That's where the amenities are, and for the population we serve, that works very, very well. Very few of our guests and then our tenants have cars. So we do want to be building in downtowns where amenities are walkable or achievable for short, public transportation ride.
Maybe just to shout out one other bit of legislation, the Homes Act from I think 2 years ago, that addressed some of the zoning barriers that are absolutely still lingering in communities. But I think now it's maybe by right to be able to add 4 units of housing on any lot that was previously zoned as for single family, and that's huge, right? That helps you theoretically quadruple the amount of production that's possible in places like essentially everywhere outside of Burlington, where a lot of the construction that's happening has been single family in recent years.
When I think about the barriers to conservation, I think about it through the lens of a private landowner. And that's because all of the conservation that the Vermont Land Trust and other private land trusts have done is with private individuals who either donate their development rights or sell their development rights. And so we need them, right? We need private landowners to want to make these choices, and we need to create conditions for them to be successful. So certainly, just as we've seen on the housing side, the cost of land is gone through the roof and started during the pandemic and has kept going. And so the cost of farmland is one of the issues that is really concerning to us, especially when it comes to our food supply and ensuring the vitality of our regional food system and Vermont's brand, if you will, and the food products that we supply. So we need to continue to do what we can to buy down the cost of land. Conservation helps to do that, but there's other mechanisms that we could begin to explore that could incentivize either through the tax system or other means, other ways for people to get on land, whether that's leasing, getting long-term leases, or outright buying land. We've seen, the economics of farming and forestry are tough. Like the margins are really thin. And so in order to keep this land active and productive, we have to provide, not just we, Vermont Land Trust, but kind of other service providers in our network have to continue to provide the support that farmers and landowners need in order to build successful businesses. And so we see that happening. There are other supports out there, but in this economic climate, we're worried that some of those are at risk, and we're seeing that already.
Great,
I already feel like I'm talking too much, but I will also acknowledge that what I just flagged from the Homes Act, being able to build 4 units on what was previously only a 1 unit land, makes the cost of land more expensive. So it's more valuable for developers than it was 2 years ago. So that, in a place like Shelburne might be getting in the way of land conservation efforts. So there are lots of tensions between these two industries, not industries, fields, disciplines.
Thank you all, Jess. You're definitely not talking too much. It's definitely good engagement, positive. And again, thank you guys for all of that. It was cool to hear about some of the policy progress that's being actualized through Act 181. Moving forward, this question might be a little bit tough, as Jamie, I know you were talking about how in order to strike this balance that we're talking about, we can't just tweak one thing. We have to really look at these things holistically. But if you can think of one policy tool, partnership, or funding stream to shift the balance even further in the direction of respecting the needs of vulnerable communities as well as the ecological integrity of the land, what would it be? And I know some of you already touched on this a little bit, but if, again, Jamie, you'd like to start, direct that to you.
Yeah, it's a great question. And, it's, trying to understand, is it more important to focus on what are the working partnerships we need to address these versus the policies or programs, is really important. And again, I think I'm going to defer to it's hard to choose, one because we kind of need all hands on deck right now. So, but I'm going to go with partnerships, and I'm going to say that the continuing right now in order to address a lot of critical challenges we have. And like these are complicated issues, right? So it's hard to just say we're going to fix the housing crisis or the affordability crisis, or the climate crisis or biodiversity crisis with one policy fix. But I think that there's real promise in the fact that we've now seen in the past year or two very successful collaboration. And this goes back to what Abby was saying. This is not something new, but I think it was elevated in the sense that people came together to address an issue that for many years seemed like it was never going to be solved. And so I'm referring to the land use reform that we achieved, but it was the Chamber of Commerce and Vermont Natural Resources Council and affordable housing advocates and folks, attorneys representing developers and regional planning commissions and state agencies, and the list goes on, coming together and rolling up our sleeves and saying we need to address this issue for the sake of Vermonters and for all of our work. And there was quite a bit of progress made, I think, with the notion that we had a lot on the line and we needed to show up and finally start addressing this in a comprehensive way. It was an inclusive process, as Jonathan said. There was a lot of listening, and that was really important. It wasn't everybody coming into the room saying, "I've got my silver bullet idea." I mean, we all had those ideas, but it was a lot of deep listening to understanding what was really important for everybody to address, and through that, I think people agreed that there were common themes that we had to tackle, and we moved away from there being one silver bullet recommendation to saying, let's address this together as a community. And I would say we're going to need to do the same thing, right now to look at the rising cost of property values and affordability issues that people are having and holding on to land. And so I could name a number of programs that I think are vital to keep our landscape intact or to address conservation or address housing, but I'll just kind of reaffirm the notion that we need to keep these working alliances productive so that we can tackle the other issues that need serious attention right now and implement the land use reform successfully, because it's still in an implementation phase.
As Jamie was saying, I don't know that there's a silver bullet out there. I think there's a lot of different solutions that are really important. I'm going to take a clue from Larry, who dropped a comment in the chat about infrastructure, and I think that's a really good point. There are places where it's difficult to build even in a downtown center because of a lack of infrastructure. Some towns have no municipal water or sewer service. So that means every development needs to rely on a leach field or septic system and a well. So that also goes back to a comment I made earlier about older style development, and some towns develop 10-acre zoning. so that a house had to have 10 acres on it, right? Which preserves this sort of forested feeling. And think about all the roads that have to get there, and now high-speed internet that has to get to each and every house, and everybody has to be in a car. So it does actually, it still fragments habitat because there are no longer habitat corridors. There are houses. They're just on giant lots. So I think the infrastructure is a really important piece. And I think we have to get together on this. Before my time at COTS, I worked on a development project in Stowe, and we built a 17-unit subdivision, and we built a leach field for it 20 feet from the municipal sewer line. There was a moratorium on connecting new development to the sewer line in Stowe. And that just felt like such a, wow, such a, yeah. And you look at it now, like that doesn't make sense. I mean, I understand the history of it, but it was a tricky thing. So I think we need to think about how we do that. There is some legislation or talk of legislation going through about doing sort of, and Jess may know more about this, a TIF-like development where the money for the infrastructure doesn't land on the developers, but can be paid out over time because of the increase in property tax values. So that's one mechanism that folks are talking about right now, and could be a good aid, again, in developing those village centers.
Yeah, that's called the CHIP Act, maybe Community Housing Infrastructure Program. I'm not sure exactly what it stands for, but that's exactly what its intent. And Mike, I saw your question, or no, yeah, Larry's question about water and sewer, and that's what it's designed to help offset the high costs of putting that infrastructure in place. The debates going on around that right now are, how do we make sure that we're not incentivizing the, second family home mansions in Stowe, where you're kind of cutting away from the Mount Mansfield National Forest, and how do we focus it on affordable housing, on downtown housing? So we'll see where that goes. I think what I would say about policy, other than infrastructure, which is a huge one, is actually not policy, but just a culture shift. How do we get folks more comfortable with change in their backyards and their neighborhoods, see the benefits of growth, planned growth, intentional growth, smart growth, but growth for Vermont needs to add households, needs to add families, needs to add housing units to survive and let alone thrive. And I think, as folks have been saying, these aren't in conflict. If we plan for housing and we accept, we allow it to go kind of in a more frictionless way where it really is best suited, then it also makes developers less likely to look further afield and want to develop greenfield. So it's not our first choice. It's expensive. We want to be where the people are and the action is.
I was looking at a comment in the chat from Mike. I don't know if I have a great question or great answer to his question. Yeah, about is there a way to exempt from conservation easements, housing from easements? And I'll just say a couple words about easements. Easements are just one tool, and they do certain things really well and other things not very well. What they are intended to do is to restrict activity on the land, to restrict development mostly, and to protect the natural resources. And once those easements are put in place, they are perpetual, they are forever. And certainly we as an organization, we have to steward all of those easements. We have perpetual obligations to protect, to uphold them. There are amendments that come because conditions change. And I just will mention that this was before my time at VLT. There was an effort afoot, and I believe it went, into the State House to look at legislation that would allow easements to be amended even further kind of recognizing that, look, conditions are changing. And so what we set in place 30 years ago may need to be something that we look at again. And that, failed dramatically. I don't know the ins and outs of it, but there has to be political will to have that conversation about amending easements. And it has to be done very thoughtfully. The way that I see it today is that conservation as a tool is not standing in the way of development. It's not the thing to go after first. Some of the other barriers that, Jonathan and Jess have spoken to are much more important than kind of going after conservation. So that's what I would say on this topic. I'll also just say that, what I would love to see, like if I could wave a magic wand, is more collaboration at the community level between conservation organizations and housing organizations. We all work project by project, and there's good reason for that. But very rarely do we have the opportunity to come together with something that is more abstract, more in the design phase to figure out, well, how do we maybe bring these two tools together? How do we conserve land adjacent to affordable housing? Or how do we look at a whole parcel and figure out how to cluster affordable housing or cluster market rate housing in a certain area and then leave other areas open for trails or gardens or whatever? That does not happen very often in Vermont. And I would love to see more of that.
I just had one other thought looking at Mike's comment about rural areas and thinking about policy. A lot of what I think about driving around more rural parts of the state or little village centers and hamlets is we need new construction, and we also need to make it so much easier for people to maintain the housing stock that exists. You know, that's just our trades and growing the trades, which I think the state is actually really starting to do. Um, and making it easier for people to access funds, lowering the barrier to accessing funds, both like in terms of the complexity of the paperwork they have to do, the income thresholds, in general. This is a personal opinion of mine, but I just think we means test too much, and we're too afraid of people taking advantage of resources that maybe are not quite meant for them. But in the long run, I think we all the state will be better off if more people could maintain the very old housing stock that we have here.
Great. Well, thank you guys. I think that will definitely wrap up our policy section. Next, I think we were thinking of doing a couple of questions on our environmental considerations. I think Zoe will.
Yep. So this is a little bit different from policy, but we've kind of hinted at some of this, but when we're looking at housing pressure and development pressure in Vermont, I was wondering what you all had thoughts on for what types of habitat or ecosystems in Vermont are the most vulnerable to housing pressure, and thinking about those, what is at stake if there is more development? Whoever is the first thought can hop on.
I could share that we've actually been tracking like some of the data to help us understand, what's most at threat, or what are we losing through our development patterns. So we took information that's available, through property tax, collection. Lands are categorized, and we looked at the very broad categories like lands that are identified or classified as residential, land that's classified as farmland, land that's classified as woodland, which is undeveloped forest. And then we looked at the other categories, which may be utilities, and there's a whole host of, other more minor categories. And when we put that all together, this was a project we started a number of years ago, and you can go to the VNRC's webpage and look at the parcelization, database. It tracks all of this, and you can look at the trends down into your town level or regional level. But zooming out statewide, when we looked at the data from 2005 to 2020, we lost 19% roughly of parcels that were classified as undeveloped forest land. That doesn't mean the forests are gone. It just means that it changed to a different classification. And that correlates, the acreage that was lost really correlates pretty strongly with the amount of acreage that increased in residential development. So it's interesting because we're dealing with a housing crisis, and there's a narrative, in Vermont that we're not really creating, enough housing, and that's true. We do have a lot of housing demands, but it depends what kind of housing have we been creating. Is this primary residence? Are these secondary homes that we've been building? But we have had a lot of subdivision in Vermont, and we've been able to track that. And so, in my mind, our forests are under the most threat right now as far as the development patterns we've been seeing. And that doesn't mean that they're under threat because we're just outright developing and converting our forest. It really matters the pattern of how that happens, right? So are we doing it in a smart way with good site design? And that's what I'm hopeful that through some of these recent policy changes, through incentives to help landowners look at the conservation opportunities versus just looking at outright cookie cutter subdivision, development as a way to make means to finding a sweet spot, to creating the amount of housing and doing it in the right locations, to when it comes to our forests, doing it really well. And so I would say we do need a lot of attention right now to maintain our forests, because they're critical for so many reasons, from our state tourism dollars to the whole identity of our state, to sequestering, storing carbon, to wildlife habitat, to maintaining water quality and flood resiliency. And so just wearing my conservation hat, I'd like to put a spotlight on the need to elevate the need to maintain our forests and keep them intact. And in Vermont, we're lucky because we do have still a lot of intact forest land, but making sure that we maintain connectivity between them and that they maintain resiliency over time is really important for a number of the challenges that we have.
Just because you brought up floods and flood mitigation, I don't know if this is the correct term, but riparian corridors, essentially like the kind of natural floodplains. I think we have renewed attention and being able to plan for intentional flooding and holding of water in places that are not our downtowns. I think we have an opportunity to do it, and I hope that we seize that opportunity.
On the topic of what areas have the most pressure, I guess I just add from living in the Burlington area and Chittenden County for 30 years, the farmland immediately adjacent to the city. Like Taft Corners didn't exist when I first settled in Vermont, and Spear Street was a very different place, and Dorset Street leading out of Burlington was a very different place. You felt as though you were getting into the countryside 5 minutes from downtown Burlington, and that's no longer the case. So I think that farmland, it's flat, it's generally well drained, it's got all the things, right? The greenfield development that Jess was talking about, where you're building in a field, keeps costs low, but it also rips the fabric of communities by its just sprawl. So I think on the environmental considerations, we need to shift into a mindset of building up a little higher. That's been super contentious in Burlington. Like, people were going ballistic if we were going to build a 14-story building. My goodness, right? And I think that's Yeah, we need that. We should be going up in places like Burlington and not out into further and further into Colchester and Williston and into, Jericho and Underhill. We're just going to turn into every other place. So I think we need to learn how to build up. And then I think another piece comes down to another shift, a cultural shift of what a landscape is. Um, in my spare time, I'm an avid habitat gardener, right? And it's amazing what you can do with a small area in terms of combating a biodiversity crisis, right? You can plant native plants that are native to your particular region, and the wildlife comes, and this is bees and pollinators and all kinds of things. And the last project Jess and I worked on together, we tried to instill native plants on the landscape, right? Even though it's downtown Burlington, there's a benefit there that aids flood resilience, that aids the biodiversity crisis. So I think that's something we can all shoot for too.
I would just add, and I know Abby probably wants to jump in with something here, but just that data I was sharing with you before, farmland, farmlands, I mean, forest land saw the greatest, decrease in the categories we were tracking, but farmland, saw about a 10% decrease. And so just underscoring the fact that, we are losing our productive, agricultural lands at a noticeable clip as well. Yeah.
And just the note about farmland, I think we saw during COVID, we were reminded of the importance of our agricultural system, our food system, to be responsive and to feed ourselves when the national kind of system of food that we have set up failed us during that time. There's another initiative happening region-wide called New England Feeding New England, and it's looking at landscape scale across New England. What would it take to be for New England to be able to provide 30% of its own food by 2030? And the places where we're going to have to provide more food, where that supply is going to come from, are Maine and Vermont. And we're going to have to scale up more than what we've done already. So there's pressures on us. There's pressures from all sides, I think.
That's awesome. I had not heard about New England feeding New England, but that's definitely going to be an interesting thing to track the next 5 years. I guess that would be 2030. Yeah. Sarah wants to bump public questions to 6:50, so maybe I will just go ahead and ask our last kind of general equity question before we jump to public questions.
Honestly, I think for the sake of our getting to our questions at the end, if you just want to ask our one concluding question, then we can let everyone have their last thing to say, and then we can get to our questions in the chat.
Sure, awesome. So I guess our last question from me and Sarah is gonna go ahead and be about moving forward, which is how do we develop housing in Vermont without compromising habitat and land while also addressing the housing crisis?
Okay, I see why you call it tough conversations now.
Yep.
That's a tough question. I'll jump in if folks don't mind. I mean, I think there's a need for deep investment in affordable housing. It is so expensive to build and to make a project pencil out so that a person is actually only paying 30% of their income for rent. It's really hard to do. I think that's one big piece. I think in terms of compromising habitats, I think we've talked a lot about sort of downtown and infill development, and I think that's a real big key. It is harder to do. It's more expensive to do, and it's the right thing to do. we need to be doing that in all of our downtowns and villages. And I'll stop there. Thanks.
Yeah, I agree. I think just continuing to invest in the places where we have invested, and that means investing in infrastructure, investing in the existing housing stock, and investing in new and, to Jonathan's point, in some settings, taller and denser housing. Um, and that, relieves the pressure on undeveloped lands to stay that way.
Yeah, I'll underscore that point. The infrastructure, the costs of our wastewater systems, right, and the infrastructure that we need is a barrier, um, and we do need to find ways to invest in that infrastructure, um, and to I'll sort of second the notion that looking at sort of the areas that we want to have identified, for growth, which are more in our downtowns and village centers, is certainly in keeping with smart growth principles and keeps down the cost. There's a certain cost to developing out into really rural areas, and the cost of community services can be quite high for that kind of development. Now, having said that, I mean, we are sympathetic to the fact that a lot of people, move to Vermont to be, close to nature and to enjoy our natural, scenic beauty and have access to our forests. And so I don't think it's reasonable to say that that's just where we're going to focus our development. We're going to continue to develop out in more rural areas, and rural communities feel like they need to have their share too of incentives, to do smart growth in their communities too and have the resources. And so I think a lot of this conversation we've been having at the statewide level has been how to do it, on both sides. Um, and so I would say that we need to keep in mind that it's about, smart growth patterns in our more rural areas. So how do we have the incentives that we've been talking about for landowners to have choices so that they can look towards balance both conservation opportunities, and then as we are developing in our more rural areas, doing it in the best way possible. And that then leads to really needing to have good, land use planning. And the sleeper issue in the Act 250 reform was it also elevates the role of regional planning. And there's going to be a lot more now intensive sort of rolling up the sleeves and doing some of that work that Abby was talking about, where how do we look sort of at conservation, housing together, transportation? How do we look at all of sort of our planning needs, infrastructure needs at one time, and figure out the best areas for more intensive development, the best areas to maintain as sort of working lands, working forest, agricultural production, where our most critical wildlife habitat areas, where are the areas we need for maintain our headwater functions and flood resiliency. So that planning is going to be happening. So I think these are all pieces of the puzzle, and we need to be focusing on all of them at the same time.
I think the other thing that we have to do is we have to grow our tax base, and we need more people in Vermont in order to grow our tax base. I don't know if any of you have tried to hire a contractor in the last 4 years, but their lead times are out 2 or 3 years, and the costs are keep going up. Labor is scarce. That goes back to our population. Our population has stagnated. It's growing. It's aging. And so there's a cyclical thing that's happening. And so it's a little bit of, it seems like maybe kind of a paradox. Well, how are we going to solve the housing crisis by having more people move to Vermont? Isn't that going to make the housing crisis worse? Well, I'm not going to answer that in the short term. I'll leave it to Jess and Jonathan. Maybe that's a question I'll toss to you all. But if this is like, we need to think about it over the long term, and over the long term, in order to be more equitable as a state, more affordable as a state, we need more people moving here. And I firmly believe that we can hold these two values at the same time. If more people move to Vermont, we can continue to conserve and protect our natural resources, create environments where people want to live, and we can also provide housing in ways that are in keeping with our landscape and in keeping with our communities.
That's a great point, Abby. I just dropped the Vermont Futures Project website into the chat. If folks aren't familiar with that, that's a great way to look at this and some really good data about what growth can look like and what sort of numbers we might want to reach in order to have that viable workforce and all the things Abby was talking about.
And it's tax base, it's workforce, it's ratepayers to help spread the cost of our investment in our infrastructure. Yeah, it's all of it. One other thing that we haven't touched on, but just thinking about reasons to, you know, be targeted with our development and our conservation is that just thinking about emissions, like more than a third of the state's emissions are from transportation, and that's because so much of the population lives outside of employment centers. And also, almost half of our emissions are from heating and cooling, or really from heating our large old buildings. So, as we work on newer construction and in places that reduce our vehicle miles traveled, we really tackle both of those issues at once. Sorry for the non sequitur. Just wanted to get that out there.
All right. I'm going to read a couple of the questions from the chat that have potentially not been answered by some of the previous conversations, starting with one from Thomas Patty. With so much of the state's land privately owned, is public access to conservation land from designated village centers a concern? Do we need to explicitly plan for / prioritize parks and other open spaces as we direct more growth into downtowns?
Yes. Yeah, I think this gets to what Abby was saying earlier on about, just we can do both and we can place housing near conserved lands and trails and forest systems.
And we're seeing that. I think that there's communities all across Vermont that are very active in conservation. Conservation commissions or smaller land trusts like Jericho Underhill Land Trust. We've been involved in the protection of over 30 town forests. All of those are public access and have trails, and there's shared woodlots. There can be community gardens. So there is a strong and vital community of Vermonters that really value conservation close to where they live.
Sweet. This one comes from Jillian, and it's touching back on COVID again. But the second part of her question, since COVID, have there been any major shifts? Are there new challenges or strategies that have come up in the post-pandemic world? And have you noticed any changes in growth patterns or the way the crisis is playing out in different parts of the state?
I wish that our parcelization sort of tracker, had the data going through the whole COVID time. We'll be interested in updating that to look at that. But I was looking at some more of the state data. And so we definitely saw a spike in population, growth during COVID, a growth pattern that we hadn't seen, it was for Vermont, it was noticeable. And now it's interesting that it's trailed off. And so, what we saw was a lot of folks coming here who had the means to move here and work here. And a lot of those folks were working remotely. And so we did see a shift, I think, in the pattern of home buying. It definitely accelerated to meet the needs of people who were coming here during COVID. I would say we're also seeing noticeable uptick in climate, migration. There are people moving here from the West, and especially areas that are on fire, air quality issues. I mean, these the stories and are real, and we have people that are moving here, based on a number of different, disruptions that we're seeing. And Vermont's a very attractive place for people to move to. So it's hard for us to say, exactly how all that development pattern, played out and how much of the housing that, population growth was people who have, um, were here just with a secondary home and then decided to move back to more urban areas. But I think we did see that a lot of the growth was happening in rural areas. And the markets tightened in the areas where there was housing and more urban areas as well.
And I think it really can't be overstated how much costs have increased since 2020. I mean, like fully 40% increase in construction costs, if not more, in certain categories. Um, that was supply chain issues, compounded by labor issues, compounded by inflation, now compounded by uncertainty and tariffs. Political uncertainty really does a doozy to the ability to get development over the finish line. And interest rates, on construction loans, people's mortgages went from 2% to 6, 7, 8%. That really adds to the cost of construction. Um, and it takes a long, I think this question would be interesting to track for the next couple of years because things that, we've had projects breaking ground this spring that were initially conceived before the pandemic, and it just can take a long time to get something over the finish line. Some of those projects were appealed, some of those projects encountered financing delays or other challenges, but costs increased by hundreds of thousands, if not millions over those years. They just keep getting harder to build. And it's true for private development too. This stuff doesn't happen overnight, and so it'll be interesting to see the shift.
I think now that it's 7, I'll ask this one last question and then we'll get to wrapping up. This one was from Helen, and it sounds like there have been a lot of good initiatives and efforts to strike more of a balance, citing housing and conservation protections. What still makes this conversation tough in Montpelier and in the public arena? And how do you navigate the fact that the make or break decisions happen at the local level? It's touched on a bit, but.
All it takes is one person to appeal a project.
Well, it also goes back to Jamie's point earlier about some of the regionalization efforts that are underway with their regional planning commissions. Um, yeah, in Vermont, we love our local control, and I think we can all point to some of the benefits of that, but also some of the drawbacks. And we're experiencing those drawbacks right now, I think, as it relates to accelerating housing. Jess and Jonathan would know that much more than I do, but we see it on the conservation side too. So pushing more on the regional side feels like an important place to go. Not without controversy, though.
I mean, the work in Montpelier is tough. As I mentioned, it can take a long time to get, a successful law across the finish line. And, it's usually much easier to sort of, almost, various, interests that don't want to see a bill pass. It's almost, conventional, saying is much easier, to stop something than to actually get major reform across the finish line. So I think that, right now as the legislature is trying to tackle, education funding, and the property tax, dilemma of rising, costs of affordability, for people in owning homes and holding on to land, it's a high pressure situation. And, there aren't really, really easy answers, or else we would have already, solved them. It's going to take, a lot of creative thinking, and, there's always a perennial issue that a lot of these issues that we have to solve, take funding, and that we have constricting, funding sources right now, not growing funding sources. And so how to do that as a small state, right, with a small population, but still a lot of the same infrastructure needs as other states with much bigger populations is all this is very complicated. So I think, yes, in Montpelier, getting the reform across the finish line on these issues can be hard. And then we have to keep on focusing on, doing what we can at the local at the regional level as individuals, making, being part of our community and trying to solve these issues as best we can, working together.
Well, on that note of collaboration, I feel like as it's 7:03 and this feels like a somewhat natural stopping point, we'll probably begin to wrap things up. I think this conversation could go on for a long time. But on behalf of Zoe and Carolina and the Audubon and I'd like to extend a heartfelt thank you to all of our panelists for taking the time to be here with us tonight after work in the middle of the week. Thank you for your insight and your honesty and all of your visions. You guys have helped paint a much fuller picture of how conservation and housing are not necessarily at odds, but much more deeply connected. Thank you as well to our audience for your presence and all of your engagement and questions. You guys are great. And thank you to Sarah for all of your work behind the scenes, making this happen, putting it together and fielding our chat, managing our technology. You're the best. But I'm personally really excited to see how we can carry this momentum, outlined collaboration tonight forward, and what sorts of innovations and further collaborations and efforts come out of this environment that we're in and facing right now. But thank you all again, Abby, Jamie, Jonathan, and Jess. You guys were awesome. Have a great night.
Thank you all.
Thank
Thank
you.
you for having
Nice
us.
to be with you. Bye bye.
Okay.
Thank you all.
Have a good
Good
night, bye.
night.